Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please, can you take your seats? Welcome to Professor Lionel Green-Thompson's inaugural lecture. I'm Tracy Naledi. I'm one of the deputy deans. May I request that we all stand for the procession, please?
Here together we can do more if we share all our joy, all our pain. Together hoping and healing and building this feeling that tomorrow is ours. And no matter how far we gather to sing, to remove all our armor, we stand hand in hand and our hearts carry far as we lift up our hearts. In this land we belong, in this place of the stars.
Good evening, esteemed guests. Today we gather to mark an important milestone. But before we move into the formal proceedings, Before we move into the formal proceedings, my colleagues and I would just like to take a few minutes to share who Prof. LGT, as we call him, is to the students. Okay. We'd like to share who Prof. LGT is from the student's perspective, and hopefully that will pour into how you're able to receive today's lecture. My name is Titi Koza, and it is truly a privilege to stand before you this evening. And I stand here as a student who has spent 4 years within this faculty and who now continues that journey in pursuit of a master's in public health. Like many of my peers, I am a product of the values and intellectual culture cultivated on this campus. Leaders like Prof have helped me shape my passion for social accountability, advocacy, and healthcare leadership. For us students, Prof's leadership is not distant or abstract. We experience it in spaces we sit in and the responsibilities he encourages us to carry. I first came to be more familiar with Prof through student leadership spaces I might not have entered on my own, because he has a way of placing students in unfamiliar environments and always insisting that students' representation must be actively lived. At some point, I thought student representation was his favorite phrase because he said it in every single meeting. And being invited into these spaces and being affirmed within them transformed how I see myself. Places that once felt intimidating became spaces where I realized I had both a voice and responsibility, pushing me further along my academic and leadership journey. And what stands out the most about Prof leadership is not only his ability to inspire us, but his accessibility. Whether you're bumping into him in the cafeteria or seeing him sitting in the quad, he makes himself available to the students, not as a distant authority figure, but as someone who is willing to listen. I recall a moment when the students and I sought to be heard, perhaps a little bit louder than usual, many, many years ago. We arrived at the Dean's Suite, unsure what we're trying to achieve by that. Security was tight and the door was locked. And in that moment, we simply just knocked and I said, Prof, it's TT. And immediately the door was open, not just physically, but in every sense of the word. He stepped out ready to listen to us, to engage. And what stood out the most was that it didn't just end there. The conversation continued throughout meetings and discussions where those concerns were actively addressed till this day. And in that moment, we saw leadership that doesn't shy away from discomfort, but actually leans into it. Leadership that listens, responds, and treats accountability as a continuous commitment. The theme of today's lecture resonates deeply within us as we come from diverse communities, carry our own stories, but actually meet at the point of responsibility. and we leave this institution preparing to serve both our communities and the wider world. Prof, our faculty dad, thank you for challenging us, for affirming us, and showing us that what responsive leadership actually looks like. And we promise to carry these lessons forward, and we will remember you when we're ministers of health. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ludo Bikok. I'm a medical student. I had a privilege of serving as the chairperson of the Health Science Student Council during his tenure in 2024. And what stood out for me was not just his role, but how he chose to show up in it. In a system where you can often feel as if you're distanced to the deanery and its hierarchical, he made leadership feel accessible. He listened intentionally. He engaged even when conversations were uncomfortable. And in doing so, he reminded us that students are not just part of the system, but they're part of its conscience. At a time where many of us were grappling with what it means to study and practice medicine in South Africa, the financial implications of it as well, in a country shaped by deep inequalities, complex histories, and ongoing need for transformation. And consistently, his leadership pointed us back to one thing: responsibility. Responsibility to our patients, responsibility to our communities, and responsibilities to the kind of health system that we are helping to shape. And what I came to understand through this is that social accountability is not just something that we learn about in lectures. It is something that we experience in how institutions lead and how they respond to their people. And in many ways, Prof. LGT modeled that. He created a space not just for excellence, but for questioning as well. Not just for achievement, but for reflection. Not just for producing graduates, but for shaping professionals who understand the weight of the context in which they'll be practicing. As students, we may not remember every policy and strategy we see, but we remember how leadership made us feel. Whether we were heard, whether we mattered, whether we belonged. And I think that is part of what we're honoring this evening. A leadership that did not simply guide an institution, but helped shape a generation to think more critically and act more consciously, and most importantly, serve more intentionally.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sayurin, fifth-year student. And I know what you're all thinking. It's just like Prof to have students run his inaugural. But no, we're just here to do this introduction before things get a bit too serious. So, funny story, UCT was the only university that accepted me to study medicine. So I didn't particularly want to be here in the beginning. But looking back after a few years, I can't imagine that I would have become half the student that I am or the person that I am today had I been anywhere else. And I really can't imagine having any other dean. I really think we got the best one. We really are privileged in this faculty to be led by Prof. As you've heard from the other students, he really engages students with such a profound sincerity, which contributed to a culture of recognizing students as genuine partners, as genuine knowledge partners, as co-creators within the institution. And for better or worse, this culture has emboldened us and has helped us become disruptive in some spaces even. I'm part of a student group that comes together from across the country and beyond to think critically about our training as future health professionals. It's a very progressive and radical space. We have conversations from constructive alignment and assessment all the way to global health justice and how the latest UN resolutions affect service delivery in a region in health. And this initiative was only possible because one day when we were in second year, Prof entertained us complaining about PBL, as we do. He gave us his time and energy, and more than that, he continued to humor us as we followed up on those complaints. And he challenged us. He actively supported us as we developed, as we questioned the way that we questioned things. in trying to build around the system, but also within ourselves. Prof sincerity with students has had a significant ripple effect. It's UCT students that co-chair the student components of the Consortium of Medical Schools in Africa, and we're working towards bringing together a continental student body. UCT students coordinate the student task force for AMI, the International Association for Health Professions Education. At a meeting last year with around 70 students, mostly European from the Middle East and North Africa, in a capacity development sort of thing, there was a question on what does social accountability mean? And it was only the UCT students that were able to give a substantial answer. And that was quite interesting. Reflecting on that, it's because we're trained in this environment where we have examples of people like Prof doing the work that he does, helping us think about how we fit into this complex interaction of systems, of knowledge building, of healing, of educating, of research. And this really does matter because it shapes the kind of care we will deliver one day as healers, teachers, and leaders, and about how we might remain accountable to those who will serve. Thank you for having us, Prof.
Good evening, everyone. Dingusabelo Stole, and I have about 3 minutes, and I'd like to tell you guys a story. So I once overheard a conversation, not in the lecture hall like this, not in the corridors of a university, but in a place far more ordinary. It was a small village, you know, the kind of place that makes the world feel significantly small and impossibly vast at the same time. So there beneath the tree, you know, a shadow, the shade of a tree, sat two figures. One was young, you know, it was curious, it was restless, carrying with it questions that are far too heavy for its ears. And then there was an older one, a quiet one, more deliberate, carrying the kind of stillness that you carry once you've, you know, seen the world and come back from it. And so the younger one spoke first, and it asked, "Tell me, how does one leave a place like this and become significant to a world so large?" And the old one smiled, not dismissively, no, but knowingly, and it said, "You do not leave it behind, you carry it with you." And the younger one was like, it frowns like, "How does something so small matter to a world so big?" And the older one said, "No, no, 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 no. It only seems small to you because you haven't seen what it becomes in the hands of someone that understands it." And then there was a silence, you know, the kind that makes it feel uncomfortable. And then finally, the young one asked, "What if I fail? What if I go into the world and I discover that I'm not enough? That where I come from is not enough?" And the older one spoke and it said, "You see, you're measuring yourself against the world as if it is fixed, yet the world is something that is shaped again and again by people who carry something with them." And almost as if remembering it said, "You see, the mystery of human existence is not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for." And then it said, "You know, this place that you come from, the things that you carry from it, your stories, your dignity, your understanding of human beings, it's not something to outgrow. It is something to offer to the world." And the young one looked up intently. "You know, what does the world ask of me in return?" And the old one said, "It's simple. It asks of you that as you continue to grow into the world, that you remain accountable to it. Not to the world as if it's some abstract concept, no, but to the people who shaped you." And then it went on to say, you know, to love someone is to see them as God intended them. To serve the world is to see people and recognize them, recognize their dignity, their stories, and to act in response to it. And the young one fell silent. Not because it had run out of questions, simply because its questions had changed. Ladies and gentlemen, that story is representative of the kind of conversations that I have with Prof. He's become my mentor, and that is literally how our last conversation went. And he asked me to come up here, not sing his praises. So I suppose I'll leave it to the floor to decide what kind of leader he is. Thank you.
Colleagues, students, honored guests, members of the University of Cape Town, members of the faculty, Good evening. Good evening. I blame Sabelo for that silence. So allow me to take this moment to welcome you to this evening's lecture, inaugural lecture by Professor Lionel Green-Thompson. And I found out that in this faculty, he's called the LGT. And I thought you only have LGB, but so I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening. In particular, I'd like to welcome family, Professor Green-Thompson. Thank you for being here, for joining us. And I can assure you that the lecture will be delivered in a way that will be easy for all of us to understand. If that does not happen, I will take issue with the lecturer. But inaugural lectures are meant for everyone from diverse backgrounds, and also for you as the family to actually see what he's been doing for now several decades, investing in his scholarship. Andy, I'm just going to mention you because you're so cool. Just welcome you as well. This is the daughter. Thank you for being here. I also want to welcome the platform party and all the guests that are here. Thank you for being here, but just allow me to introduce our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, Professor Brandon Collier-Reid. Thank you for being here. And also our DVC for People, Culture and Society, Professor Eleron Ramgondo. Thank you for being here. We also have a guest, the head of the Western Cape Department of Health and Wellness, and he will offer a vote of thanks. Thank you, Dr. Keith Klute. Thank you for being here. Let's give him a warm round of applause. We very much appreciate the partnership that the university and the faculty have with the department. Much appreciate you being here. And Chris Pierce, is Chris here? Thank you. Thank you for being here. We'll leave your surprise to the end. He will give closing remarks for us. I should also just thank the students who stood up to share a few stories. Thank you guys for doing that. Much appreciate you being bold to stand in front of everyone, to share in the way that you've done, but also just sharing your experiences in the faculty and the experience of your experience of the deanery and the leadership, which is appropriate tonight, given that the dean is delivering the inaugural lecture. Much appreciated and well done. Let's give them a round of applause. So this evening, the lecture is titled From a Village to the Globe. I guess maybe that's what Sabelo was talking about. Reflections on a Journey in Social Accountability. As you can hear in the title, it focuses on social accountability and particularly in health professions education. Now, as a university in general, we find ourselves at the intersection of teaching and learning, research and science, as well as responsiveness and service to society. And I think in some ways, health professions education captures that. There's not a lot of faculties that are actually embedded in the service environment in the way the Faculty of Health Sciences is, where you actually teach students bedside in the environment where they work. It has become so normal in health sciences that I would say we take it for granted that that's how it's got to be. But because we have an opportunity to see how training happens in other places and how difficult it is to actually train people where they work, where you bring the teaching, the research, and the service together, we understand the privilege that we have in health sciences education. And that's why the presence of the head of health in the province being here means so much to the work that we do, given the platforms that we have for teaching and learning and also for research. So let's not take it for granted just because it's become so common and familiar and something that we do every day. But also at that intersection, we also have to ask ourselves questions about the relevance of what we teach, what we research, what we do to the needs of the people that we serve. You know, as universities, we know that we can be very resistant to change. Try and change the medical curriculum. You will find out. Some years back, about 12, 13 years ago, I did work a little bit with LGT when he was still at Wits. And I was in Natal collaborating in a multi-institutional study called Transformation in Medical Education, looking really at that pivotal point, what sort of changes should we be introducing in medical education? My goodness. I hope that we'll get to understand some of these challenges. But at that point, something is really important. It's got to do with the relevance of our education and how responsive it is to the needs of our patients, of our communities, and our society. And that's when I got to learn about the theory of transformative learning theory and the importance of introducing these dilemmas that we need to introduce for our students to better grasp the reality that our patients come from and have to live in order for the practice of medicine to be successful and effective and impactful. And so accountability to society is not something that is conceptual for us, those who teach medical students. It is not theoretical, it is very tangible, it's very practical. And it was not until a few years later that I also understood that even as a university, we have to be accountable to the public. We have to be accountable to society. You will hear a lot about academic freedom. We use it all the time. I use it a lot. Anytime the moment says something that I don't like very much, I will waive that ticket. It's like, you know, I have academic freedom. If I don't waive the academic freedom card, I will waive the institutional autonomy card. We are a university. We are governed by principles of institutional autonomy. But do you know which card I don't waive? The third card in those pillars is public accountability. Public accountability goes hand in hand with academic freedom and institutional autonomy. But we rarely ever talk about it. Because if the public, if society, if other people knew that that freedom, that academic freedom that we have goes hand in hand with public accountability, we would not enjoy that academic freedom very much because we will have to answer. Now, for most of you who do service work, generally, you make your work relevant to communities that we serve. And perhaps you understand this a lot better than others. But I think it's important that we actually think about how to make social accountability and public accountability practical and tangible for ourselves, so that when we come about the privileges that when we talk about the privileges that we have as educators, as researchers, the privileges that we have of being part of this academic space that allows us so much freedom, that we also think every day about the accountability that we have, the responsibility that comes with that privilege. So within that conversation, a lot of it has to do with the values. And I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk about the values of Ubuntu, values of compassion, values of kindness, of respect. These are things that govern our responsibility, our relationship with patients, our relationship with communities. But we don't talk a lot about them. We don't talk so much about them. And I understand, I too enjoy the technical aspects of medicine. I enjoy the technical aspects of science. I enjoy having to sit and crunch data and look at the graphs that come out that are beautiful. All of that is amazing. But then there are other things that go hand in hand with that. Ubuntu. But often we just talk about it, but we don't hold each other, we don't hold one another accountable to ensuring that we live those values of Ubuntu. And in a world that is torn, fragmented, and fractured, like the world that we live in, it's become ever so important that we do that. And ever so urgent that we do that. Not just for ourselves, not just amongst ourselves, but also for the people that we teach, for the next generation of leaders that is currently in 4th year, in 5th year, in 1st year, who look to us. So, LGT, we are looking forward to the lecture for you to help us crystallize these thoughts, these ideas, We are gathering here in recognition of the science of medicine, but also the art of medicine. In recognition of these values that we are talking about. In recognition of the scholarship that goes into this work. In recognition of the education and the mentorship and the supervision that goes into it. The collaboration and the partnerships that go hand in hand. On behalf of the University of Cape Town, I extend my sincere congratulations to you, Professor Green-Thompson, on this significant milestone. We are very proud of your contribution to this institution in particular, but also to the field at large with your work. Let me now invite our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Collier Reid, to introduce our inaugural lecturer. Thank you very much.
You can tell our VC is a medical professional, can't you? All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Brandon Collier-Reid, and it's really a pleasure to be with you this evening, and it really is a pleasure to do the introduction for Prof. L, as I've also heard him being called now. So I must confess that when I was asked to do this introduction, the first thing I did was to go to Google and to ask what had to be in an introduction for an inaugural lecture. Not having done too many of them in the past. Sorry, Lionel, I'm not really seasoned in this way of introducing it. I will get there, but what was interesting was that it turns out that this type of introduction is it's quite a formulistic thing, but it's also it's got a particular name, a laudatio. So sorry for those of you that know Latin will understand what I'm saying. And maybe we shouldn't be using words like that really in this particular context. But the reason why I'm using it is because it's said to be an expression of praise, commendation, and testimony of character. And I thought that was quite a nice framing for an introduction like this, particularly, and it's really particularly fitting in Lionel's case, because his career has been defined not only by achievement, but by his character, by integrity, his humanity, his intellectual depth and deep sense of responsibility to others. So framing the introduction in this way, I think, is something that really is testament to who he is. Before I go on to talk about Lionel's scholarship and leadership, let me also echo my welcome to Lionel's family, his family and friends, the people that are online, friends that are in the audience and online. And I think what's really important is that your presence really does remind us that an academic journey like this is never, ever traveled alone. You travel it with the people that are around you, with your friends, with your loved ones. And the fact that they are here this evening really is a testament to who you are and also recognition of the value that they've played in your life. So Lionel's lecture this evening, From a Village to the Globe, Reflections on a Journey in Social Accountability. This really does speak directly to the central thread of his life's work. The conviction that health professions education must be accountable to the people and communities it ultimately serves. So for Lionel, that conviction has not remained at the level of rhetoric. So under his leadership, the faculty has pursued meaningful curriculum transformation grounded in social accountability, outcomes-based education, and the preparation of graduates who are responsive, adaptive, and able to work in complex environments. He has helped to foreground community voice, to deepen partnerships with health systems, and to create structures that align education, research, and service with the health needs of society. His leadership is rooted in the philosophy of ubuntu, and the Vice Chancellor has already spoken a bit about Ubuntu in this context. The understanding that our humanity is realized in relationship with others. And this is a really important part of who Lionel is as a person. Now, that idea has shaped not only his scholarship, as I've said, but also his institution building. And some of the students spoke about that today in their presentation a little bit earlier. Under his leadership, the faculty has established and strengthened a social accountability focus in its governance, including the Deputy Dean portfolio for social accountability and health systems, as well as created spaces which students could become genuine co-creators of curricular reform, perhaps most notably through the student curriculum Lekgotla, another one of the things that the students have spoken about a little bit earlier. Lionel's influence extends far beyond the faculty. He has been a significant national leader in the transformation of specialist medical education, particularly through his work on workplace-based assessment, a reform that can be considered the first major transformation in specialist medical assessment in more than 20 years. That is really a significant achievement that he's been involved with. He has helped develop the academic rationale for this change. He's co-developed the national training initiatives, as well as supported implementation across South Africa's medical schools. A really significant achievement of the work that he's done over this time. He is also recognized internationally as a scholar and a leader in health professions education. His research record includes local and international publications, book chapters, editorial roles, and major contributions to international scholarly guidance. He currently serves in international academic networks, including as Vice General Secretary of Towards Unity for Health, and as the chair of the International Association of Health Professions Education Network on the medical education in resource-constrained settings. And I managed to get that out in one breath. Lionel, that's an impressive organization that you're involved with there. It is therefore entirely fitting that Lionel was recently awarded the 2026 Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada's Charles Boelen International Sociability Accountability Award in recognition of his outstanding and unwavering commitment to social accountability. And actually, I want to give him a round of applause. I had to be part of the process of motivating for this achievement for Lionel, and to do so, I had the honor of reading through once again the documentation that supported that. And I must just say to the people here, it really was a very, very impressive resume and a testament to the work that Lionel has done over many, many years. So this is an international honor of considerable distinction, an affirmation that Lionel's work resonates not only here at UCT or in South Africa, but across the global community of health professions education. But perhaps what is most striking about Lionel's career is that its excellence has always been tethered to purpose. His work asks, who is health education for? Whose voices count? And what does it mean for a university not only to teach well, but to serve justly? These are not easy questions, Lionel, but they are necessary ones. And Lionel has spent his career helping this university, this country, and this field in general to answer them with seriousness, with compassion, and to answer them with imagination, some of which we've heard from the students a little bit earlier today. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Lionel Green-Thompson to the podium.
I decided to start this lecture sitting down because there are two things I want to share with you. Feels loud. That I want to share with you before I get on with the business of this evening. and I should say wamkelekile. And the third word, tawedes, is what the First Nations of this area would have said to you if they should have met you when there were no other people around. I want to start with just us asking you to reflect with me about Giovanni Perez. Gio was the head of the Metro West District Health Services, and I think you can read the slide for the rest of it, but I ask you just to spend this moment in honor and reflection with me about him. The words on the right-hand side were taken from the pamphlet at his funeral 10 days ago, and they're written by somebody who's in the audience this evening. But the second one is my reflection on this book, which I ended up finishing a couple of weeks ago now, probably a month or so ago. And I read it because it was given to me by a scholar that I really do respect. And so I want to just read the comment written in the foreword of this book by Jamil Khan, because that's the position that I occupy without apology, without anything, but just to say, think about this as you think about, I opened a racism conference the other day and I asked people, what do you see? And I noted that in the political correctness of the gathering, they didn't feel comfortable to say they see a colored. But I think that Jamil Khan captures this idea of the coloredness that I believe in, or that I think doesn't exist or does exist. But really with this idea of compassion, colored calls us to account for our own complicity as colored people and for our anti-Blackness, while offering us facts to confront those epistemologies of ignorance in which we have been incentivized to participate. And so as we reflect on these things, we recognize that everything that we say and everything that we do tells some kind of story. And so you can decide to use that or not use it this evening in your lens to look at what I have to say this evening. I want to start on reflecting on the title of this evening, From a Village to the Globe. I reckon that I had to explain it when one of my colleagues sent a message on Facebook saying, oh, I'm also from a village. And I'll come to the town that I'm from just now. But the village that I speak about in this title is the village of Lehorotse, which is on the border with Botswana in the Northwest Province. It is the place that I went to hear my first community engagements on social accountability. And I'll speak about how that community was unable to articulate a way that they could hold their doctors accountable. Note that I spoke to specific groups of people who were not in the queues at clinics. They were not in need of care at the time that I spoke to them. But it is about the globe, because exactly 10 days from today, I will be presenting in receipt of that award that Brandon speaks about, the Charles Boelen Award. I'll be speaking, that's a picture of the Rogers Center in Ottawa, where I'll be delivering the Charles Boelen address this year, literally 10 days from now. And my reflections of this idea from a village to the globe really wants to emphasize the idea of our responsibility as scholars to amplify the voices of the poor people that we encounter. And so perhaps for the first time, the voices of somebody from Lehorotse will be heard in Ottawa and for the globe. And so when I say reflections on a journey in social accountability, I suspect I'm taking some level of license, because that allows me to be deep or superficial as I determine. They are, after all, only reflections. Social accountability is this idea that we have an obligation as institutions to direct our education, our research and service towards the priority health concerns of the community or the region we are mandated to serve. And this evening, as I greet you with this definition hanging, I really do want to thank Keith for agreeing to be part of the party this evening and to offer a vote of thanks, because in fact, at the heart of social accountability is the co-creation of institutions together with the agencies of those who govern the people. And we won't always agree, it's true, but we have an obligation to sit together and craft what the solutions look like. I suppose I should at this stage greet a few people. Let me say to the VC and the platform party, good evening. And to my family who've come out in numbers this evening, those online and those here in the room, thanks very much for being a part of this. And I'm going to thank the two priests who've come with me today, Father Charles Princes from the parish I worship in Pinelands, and Father Peter John Pearson, who, if you don't know who he is, you're living in the wrong city, a mischief maker of note. But I welcome them because a large part of this talk will speak about the identity that I have formed over these last years. So social accountability, in taking on this idea of location in the service of people, speaks about the fact that health education institutions can't work outside of this partnership pentagram. Or rather to say the partnership pentagram is an essential lens with which to look at how we become accountable. Policymakers, health administrators, health professionals, communities, and academic institutions are all part of this continuous moving cycle of partnerships and relationships, which become so integral. And you'll see from the extract at the bottom, it's from an article in an article written by Makerere University. And what Boelen does in this article, he really highlights the idea that it's critical for us to move from responsiveness to accountability. Now, this is a real thing for institutions like ourselves, which work with communities a lot. But I'm not sure that we account for what those communities think of us. So they speak in our community advisory boards, they tell us what should or shouldn't be done in a research project. But I'm not sure that when we leave, if we left a Vanguard clinic tomorrow, would the Vanguard people be better off? And I want to argue, I think we don't. Partly because maybe something is attacking you here. But I think is this one? Partly because we have no mechanism. Even I'm sounding soft at that point. But partly, colleagues, because we have never created mechanisms when we enter a community to say, one, what is it that they want us to do? And two, what effect do they want to see because we were there? And for me, that's the nature of this. And so if you look at Charles Boolen's proposal in this framework, accountability means that our aims are defined by society. They're contextualized within that society. And the graduates we produce, they are intentionally produced to be change agents. Because what they seek to do is create impact, and they ensure that there's a partnership built around them, the work that they do and the people that they encounter. In their paper in 2010, Frank and Chen wrote a piece called Health Professionals for the 21st Century. And it is really a landmark paper, mainly because it recalled the writings of Flexner in 1910. Flexner is credited with moving us into the biomedical age. In their paper, Frank and Chen and a whole lot of others, including some South Africans on that authorship panel, speak about 3 ages of education of health professionals. They speak about the age of information, where facts were being collected, the age of formation, in which professionalism was being developed, and then the age of transformation, in which we were creating these change agents. And I will flash a series of slides that I will not explain tonight, but I want you just, in reflecting on students, nothing was more disorientating for me when I arrived here on the 16th of March to close the university. Because for many months I looked out at that quad and there was just nobody. And over that period, you'll see, for many of you who speak to me online, you'll see I have the picture that Karen took of a rainbow across that quad. And that was taken in June of 2020. And really, when we first realized that we might actually get graduates out that year. That was the time that the first 6th years arrived on the 1st of June at that time. Again, because I think it was Vanessa Birch who said to me in that period, where I think I was convincing people that the students had to come back. And Vanessa said to me on occasion, how odd it is for us to be saying that when there's a crisis, the medical students should run for the hills. And so bringing them back was not always an easy thing. There were many different moving parts that we had to convince. But this is the class, colleagues. the 2012 class that I'll come back to about my PhD. But I want to say tonight to the students, both the undergraduate and the postgraduate students that I've worked with, you are all three of those ages of education for me. You are at once my age of information, because the stories you tell me, whether you're a high achieving student getting disorientated by your lack of compassion, or you're a student who's struggling to get through and you want to be convinced that you can make it, that information across my desk has served me well, because you've been my time of formation as well. You have been able to tell me stories and challenge me for the discourse that I'm having. When Luto speaks about times of trouble, I think he speaks really well, because there's nothing like being on the front line of a student protest when you know what it's like to be coming from the other end. But what I want to say is that the students, you are too my age of transformation, because every time I speak to students, and now increasingly with the student curriculum in Makgatho, I am reminded that I don't lead for this moment. I lead in order for the students to take their rightful place and show us perhaps a way to go. So these different pictures, that's Luto at the launch of our fundraising campaign the other year. This is Karen and Dina Ruth. Moaz and Sayuran were the first students to serve from UCT. Stellenbosch, Martin, that one. But the first students from UCT to serve on the International Task Force at the AMI conference, a conference of over 4,000 delegates. But that is also the conference at which Sayuran and the student curriculum Makgatho won the award for the transformation in that student curriculum. This picture is a special one for me, because this was the occasion in which we celebrated the Cuban trained graduates. At UCT, we hosted the graduation that year. And I hope that some of them are somewhere, either in the room or online, because one of the things that I found as a significant transformation was to share those students' time. In a time where other students were devaluing them often, to spend time with them, hearing how they value themselves, and how they went on into places in the country which are completely transformed. Often people refer to specialization as a mark of the success of this program. I want to argue no. It's because they went back to Boelen, that first primary healthcare clinic, and the same guy is now a medical manager at Gray's Hospital. That's the success of this program. It's marked by the fact that, yes, its time may have run out now, but the reality is that it made a difference and I think we can learn many things from the program. But it is to the students, I really want to say just how much you have made my journey to this place. Last year, Sarah Stein wrote this piece in the Daily Maverick. The title was What They Don't Teach Me at Medical School. She spoke about a quiet night in the ward that she was in, and she writes, the patient reminded me of the real value of being a healthcare practitioner. She claims she did nothing. She just sat holding the guy's hand. And isn't that the everything of care? She says, I didn't really treat him, but I made him feel cared for. And that made a difference. And that's the heart of social accountability. She says, what I do know is that this work has shaped me in ways I'm still trying to understand. And for all its chaos and pain, I feel lucky to have been part of it, even just for a little while. And she's in the throes in that article of deciding medicine or not medicine as a long-term career. But building on that thought of meaning and being part of the story, Asante Sabelo Sitole, who you heard earlier, a second-year medical student, wrote this in his essay to be part of an international organization that I've encouraged him to do. I believe that meaning is not something we discover within ourselves, but it's something we build through service to others. He goes on to tell some stories, not unlike the story he told this evening. I realized that service, real service, does not always mean solving every problem. Sometimes it means simply standing beside someone while they face it. And friends, colleagues, that's the spirit into which I come into this inaugural lecture. It's not a moment of triumph in the traditional sense. It is the culmination of a mosaic of different experiences over a career. I graduated in 1988. So it's been a long career, but these last years have been characterized by encounters that have brought me a great sense of joy. And so to get this, and I'm deeply mindful of my colleagues who at some point would have had to vote that I could get this. I want to just say, enkosi kakhulu. I see you're all very tight-lipped about the discussions that happened behind closed doors, and I won't press you. But it is a thing of the stories that we have to tell. And this afternoon, when Tracy heard that I had more than 50 slides, she said, "Oh my goodness, I hope you've got a lot of jokes." I went home sweating and actually removed a lot of them from the talk. But no, they're not nearly 50 slides. This is a picture from where I grew up. That is a house in Vryheid, an anomalous name for us colored people in that area. How could they call the place Vryheid? But it was because it was the capital of the Boer Republic, which formed around Vryheid in the time of, must have been the Boer War at the beginning. Next to me there, and I only speak about the one child, Natalie. Natalie may have been the reason I ended up in medicine, because Natalie was a really sickly child whose mother didn't stand sickness very well. So I was often looking after Natalie when she had a whooping cough, when she was in the oxygen tent, and all sorts of things, because my dad would set those things up for her in the house. The picture below, and I'll speak to that just now, is the church the Catholic parish in Vryheid called Thomas More. And I'll speak a little bit about that, because my life is formed in this space between what was perceived as marginalization, because we were only 5. And when I use colored colleagues, I use it very pejoratively in many cases. We were only 5 colored families in town. So we used to go to church, and we just sat in the last 2 rows in the church. They weren't labeled. Nobody told us to sit there. We just sat there. That's our behavior. There was a Zulu mass for the domestics at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm sure some of you know those parishes across the country. I show this picture because that's the house my parents owned, and so it gave us a certain status and immovability in the town. They couldn't move us because we owned the place. And I show that church because it was there that I recognized the polarities of opposites. So the German priest was a real horror, but the German nuns were people that were really close to my heart. And so can I say Germans are bad? Can I say that they are good? I don't think I have enough information on either of those. But it's where my mother had a conversation in the Catholic women's group when one of the women said, "I think we must knit." You know, there was that Esme Everard show. We used to like it. The music was good. But there was a blanket movement, right? And the women said, "Let's knit for the boys on the border." And so my mother was quiet for a second or two, usually never for more than a second, actually. My mother said, "Actually, I'm more likely to knit for the other side." Needless to say, that conversation didn't come up again. But the polarity I want to say to you was so formative in my life is that when one of the women's son was seriously injured in a limpet mine explosion in the border by Swapo, my mother was able to take care of the child with them. And so in my life, there are these tensions all the time of what it means to be outside and inside. It was one of the really great things that we went to Rosary at these white women's homes. And we used to sit under the table everywhere we could because there used to be 20 people in a lounge, and they really made nice tea and cake. But it's part of those things. And they came to our house, actually. It was not a thing that didn't happen. But it was this tension that I couldn't go to the library in Vryheid, but I could sit at homes and be part of conversations that were related to faith. Vryheid's an interesting town. It's the place which still had a siren when I was a child. A siren used to go off at 9 o'clock. And Indian people had to leave town to go to Dundee, half an hour away. African people had to retreat to Beguzulu location. That's where we grew up. But somehow coloreds could bounce around the street without any trouble in the middle of the night. The second picture is probably my first foray into scholarly writing. I'm not sure everybody would regard it as scholarly, but here we are. We wrote a book in our fourth or fifth year of medicine. I was part of a group called Young Christian Students, and that's why reflecting on geo has been a really powerful thing for me in the last little while. We wrote this book, Action Towards a People's Church, because in YCS at UCT, we were all really middle-class people. I was the first Black person to join YCS on that campus, but we were really all middle-class people. After all, I did have a father who was a GP and a mother who was a nurse. But one of the things we struggled with is Christianity's failure to take responsibility for its crimes across the century. And so what we wrote in that book, and there are many chapters, my chapter was the history of the Christian church. And it reflected on how the Catholic Church, particularly my church, the one I belong to deeply faithfully now, I don't have a fight just because I'm Catholic. I have a fight around the reasoning for why we think the way we do. But that chapter reflected on how the Catholic Church almost led the conquests of South America. That there were prophets like the Las Casas who told the governments that they actually were reasonable people. They actually were human, the natives that they were conquering in the way that they were. I went to Canada in 2022, and Pope Francis had just visited the indigenous peoples' reserves in that area, just after that scandal of the residential schools came out. And you will recall that we continue to answer for these really bad things we've done over the centuries as a church. But he says, I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously, I humbly beg for forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous people. The church had a doctrine of discovery, which gave nations the right to conquer natives. It was written into our canon law, I suppose. And that was only repealed in 2023. And so for me, I share in this collective shame. I walk this idea that I'm both an establishment person here at UCT, and I'm both the person that has to question what it is we're doing wrong and how it is we engage with the world. I raise these things because this is a book called Jesus Before Christianity, written by Albert Nolan in 1976, and maybe perhaps the most reprinted book about Jesus that has been written. Jesus Before Christianity acknowledges that Jesus Christ is a Jew who grows up in that area that we now call Palestine. But importantly, what it recognizes that if you don't see Jesus as a human being, you can never use your faith to attack injustice. And yet, that's what you're called to do if you want to be faithful at all, is the sense I have from what the history tells us. And so Albert Nolan became a really good friend in the latter parts of his life. We were part of a book club together. And so when he died in 2022, I was invited to write a reflection on my journey with him. And I bring it up here only because on the occasion where I think I was, maybe I was, possibly I was, somebody told me I was, acted on affirmatively. When I was allegedly appointed as a transformation candidate, I went to Albert with some irritation at how could people expect me to account for what the selection panel had done. And in his very gentle, very firm way, Albert said to me, why are you worrying about the things you can do nothing about? You have to be the best person they could possibly have appointed. And so in that moment that combined both compassion, humility, and a deep sense of justice, reflecting on Albert's life led me to say this, that we have to build ever more defining frames to help us understand and to enable new communities on the margin so that their rights can be respected. The sustainability of the earth on it and asymmetric power relations in society can be overcome. I didn't ask anybody to time me, which is a real problem. I happened with a deep sense of privilege, I've become part of the Consortium for Medical Schools in Africa. And I was invited to the University of Global Health Equity by their dean, Abebe Bekele, who I'm hoping is online. Paul Farmer, many of you will know, is the quintessential partner in health. the guy who understands communities and responds to their needs, whether it's in Haiti or in the founding of this University of Global Health Implications. And sitting in this mausoleum, they have a mausoleum for him on the campus. It's a beautifully crafted experience because by the end of it, you're experiencing, in the African style of speaking, amajol. And Paul Farmer is a deeply present spirit in that campus. And as I read the things he said, I found this sounds so much like liberation theology. And then to discover he's written a book with Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the father of liberation theology. And in reading this book, I saw, observe, judge, act, which is the thing that they came to together for understanding and creating social analysis. So every now and again, I will offer you moments where I ask you to see, I ask you to judge, and I start reflecting on what action might be. A bit of my undergrad life at Wits. As I see UCT students grow, I'm never sure if it was a good or a bad thing that UCT didn't accept me at the beginning. I don't say that as often as the VC, because I'm more embarrassed by it than he is, clearly. And so I want to say to you that in the September before I came, I was offered an extended program place. And my father phoned the deanery, as parents do, and I've become very familiar with this. Is this just another racist plot? What are you doing? My child is as good as anybody else's child. And then I failed second year. And in that failing, it was quite an intriguing thing because my father tried to give me a tutorial on the ligaments of the foot in August of that year, and then told my mother, that one's not passing this year. Didn't tell me, I have to say, told my mother, who kept it a secret until I actually did fail. But an interesting thing in that process is that when I came back, I was a different person. And perhaps I just needed longer time on task than the anatomy. Now that I understand that that was just time on task. I've only read about that much later in my life. But we revitalized the Black Students Committee, because at that time, Wits didn't even have a simple thing like a transport system. So if you were allocated at Barrow, you found your own way to Barrow from the center. And that was really a seminal moment in my journey. And the first president was a man called Murti Subu, who this year is celebrating his 70th birthday. And it's been an incredible thing for me to reflect on that journey for him. We resisted the partial desegregation of the Johannesburg Hospital. Maurice McGregor, who was dean at the time, a South African who'd come back from Canada, really great guy. He wrote me an incredible note when my brother died in '86. But he thought he should write to each individual student saying, can you go to the Joburg Hospital, but you have to agree not to go to gynae and obstetric. Well, you can just imagine. We went to sit in the dean's office, but I have to say, we allowed the secretaries to step over us to carry on their work. We just made it uncomfortable. We didn't push them out of their work. But perhaps the highlight of my student days was this faculty mini retreat on apartheid in the medical school. Because what we did, we sat that night, and I'm getting deja vu because I sat for most of last night doing this talk. But we sat through the night co-creating the talk. And there was some really, anyway. But we spoke to the community of the faculty, and they said, in fact, the surgical professor asked me a question and said, I want to ask the angry young man a question. And I didn't get any more angry than I was at the time. But I think it began to build a sense in the faculty that we'd worked with. And then for me, the highlight of my undergrad time was the graduation in the community. Okay. Oh, they did. So this is an article from the Indicator in Lenasia. About 15 of us were part of this sort of alternative graduation. Some of you might know Mike Urban. He was part of that graduation with me. And we went into the community to hold our own graduation, but we were very careful that we could only put the hoods on after the graduation in town had happened. So we synchronized it. So we started after them, and we were not going to be illegal or claiming things that were not real. I show this picture because this is from a calendar in 2018 celebrating 100 years of Albertina Sisulu's life. Albertina Sisulu and Abubakar Asfat worked in a primary care clinic on the edge of Soweto. and had become quite familiar to students across the time. And I use this picture because, in fact, this is the certificate we gave ourselves. We created and then we gave it to ourselves. Abu Bakr Asfat came to the graduation, was our keynote speaker, and gave it back to us. And they both signed the certificate. Albertina Sisulu could not come to the graduation. She was under house arrest at the time, but Abu Bakr was a part of it. And so I pause always at this moment because, in fact, it's in the corner of my office. I don't know if anybody sees it when they're really angry that I haven't done something, when they come to the office and ask me to do stuff. If they see that corner, I go there every now and again. But for me, the miracle of this moment is that we did this in 1988, when 1990 did not seem possible. And so for me, it's a really treasured memory that I don't think anybody noticed that bit. They couldn't care that we were there or not there. You know, it was just a thing, you know. And then in 2005, they did have a graduation to make preparation for that. And a really special event that was. I want to come back to this picture because this book is reframing my conversations again about what it means. What does the preferential option for the poor mean, and how close is it to social accountability? We run the risk of turning social accountability into an industry, and we travel across the world talking about social accountability. Oksalayo, we are not shifting the systems that we're in. We continue to talk about how to shift them, but no shift is really happening. And so I want to just share with you 4 stories that have happened to me in the last 5 years. I stood in fact, it was a provincial planning meeting, Keith, where I spoke about equity. And I announced that I had managed to secure employment equity money to shift Lynn Denny, who was not well at the time, into a strategic research post to enable us to let a Black person apply for the headship. Person stood up in that meeting and said, the trouble with UCT is you do transformation by colors. You might as well be playing a game of Ludo. That was not as problematic for me as the fact that nobody stood up in my defense. And that's been a troubling thing ever since. A little bit later in that year, I wrote an LGBT letter. And I have to share this with you. I've sent one of my letters to Father Charles, not for permission so much as to say, if they tell you that person who reads in your church is an evil guy, at least you know what they're calling me evil about. But what I did is very inappropriately wrote a letter on the very last day of October on LGBT matters, in fact, on transgender matters. And I received this letter from a senior professor telling me that tokenist also describes my impression of the university's approach to minority sexuality issues. Here was I, this country bumpkin who'd spent a little time at Wits, believing that UCT had sorted this out, that this was not an issue anymore. Clearly, I was wrong. The last one, the third one, is a letter from somebody writing to me about my propensity to appoint Black people. She spoke about it as problematic, and she said a whole lot of pejorative things about an individual, and then went on to say, somebody is going to apply for a post, you better see that they don't get the post. And I had to say to her, actually, this is a libelous email. Fortunately, the conversation ended there. But the last one, and it's not the least important one, is this idea of how we understand gender-based harm. There are really important people here who behave towards women like they're lackeys. And I'm shocked at the kinds of people who are in this conversation. But more importantly, I'm really struck in the simple story of what happens to a person when they're found guilty of gender-based harassment. It seems the system is unable to respond in a way that is meaningful. But I leave these for you to consider, because really in the imagination of Guterres, it is the sea of our reality. So what I will offer you in the next few slides, and if somebody can tell me the time, I'll speak faster or slower. I want to offer social accountability as a heuristic, as a way, in the same way that Jesus before Christianity was my heuristic as an undergrad for understanding what the scriptures were telling me. Social accountability has become my heuristic in these latter days how does social accountability help us understand simple things? At my interview, it was in this place. My presentation for this post was here. Somebody asked me the question of whether I just like primary health care. And I have to say, social accountability is not equal to primary health care. Don't get confused, because every discipline that we engage in, and I think what's happening in the tension between province and ourselves is, how do we have the conversation about social accountability? I often feel a bit schizophrenic, because when I look out at the one door, I see students who come from really poor communities and think, gee, their communities need so much. And then I recognize, as I look up throughout the other window, that in fact, I've got to defend the business of subspecialty training. These are both and parts of the conversation that we have to engage in for social accountability. Some of these slides may seem happier than the others, but this is it's a picture of the canteen, the cafeteria at Wits on the campus there. I was there about a month ago, and I took this picture, and I was just struck by the fact that it just looks the same as it did when I was there. And we had a conversation, and the reason I show this picture is that that's where I had a conversation with Bob Boelen, really the doyen of social accountability globally. And we sat on a chair talking about what my PhD could look like. And it was a fascinating conversation in 2011 that led him to co-supervising with me. I asked Trish McInerney, a nurse, to supervise my PhD. And I have to say, and I know that Trish is online in Joburg, that I chose Trish because I knew she was one of the few people who could keep me in check and would make sure that I delivered when I needed to deliver and that the PhD would finish. I want to just celebrate the role of nurses in my own nurturing and growth. Everywhere I look in my life, there's been a nurse that has pointed me in the right direction and nurtured me from places where the darkness has been greater than the light. And so in a very strong word of gratitude, I say to the nurses in my life, Kaisikai Gangan. We were laughing with the students the other day about how Barbara and I had a romance in the hospital and in the midwifery unit. And those of you who are nurses or obstetrics and gynae people would know that you don't play with labor ward nurses. You play with them at risk of your life. So we agreed that nobody could ever know that we were courting. And in fact, the first they heard that we were courting was when they got the invitation to the wedding. That was really a significant process of cloak and dagger. But again, I want to just honor nurses and their role in making sure that doctors often do the right thing. I don't think we see that enough. I don't think we honor it enough. And I don't think we give nurses the space in our system to recognize the contributions they are making on an almost daily basis. So to Trish and Bob, thank you very much for the contributions and who I'm becoming. This is where my PhD happened. I spoke about Wits. I went to the informal settlement of Boipatong. I went to Westbury, and here Honor Frida Campbell was really my achus. It seems like it's only a Joburg word. Nobody here will understand achus. It's a particular thing. But she arranged one of my interviews in Westbury. Lehurutsi is that little dot that's close to the Botswana border, to give you an idea of where it was that I went. And then this is the room that the traditional healers in Bushbuck Ridge called their headquarters. So I had a focus group discussion with the traditional healers of the area, and we held it in their office, which was that building. Interestingly, they spoke about how the fact that Wits students spent time with them allowed them to build a relationship with the hospital. So that if they had a cough that they couldn't manage, they could take them to the hospital and the hospital will accept that this was beyond their ability. I don't know how many places enjoy that kind of relationship, because we can't teach Western doctors traditional medicine. What we can teach them is a sensitivity that most of our patients will go to a traditional healer at some time or the other. And so that is a very illuminating period. I'm looking for my book if anybody knows where it is, because I only got one and I lent it to somebody in my office and I don't know who's got it now. But what I did in the PhD was talk about what the communities told me they wanted from doctors is the sense of Ubuntu. So it echoes with what you're saying, VC. They couldn't say social accountability, but they could say that if you're a doctor who had Ubuntu, you would know how to treat me. Because in that spirit of Ubuntu, you would know that I am a real person. What has happened in this group, and we chose I chose the team to write with me after I'd been invited to write this chapter. Dina Ruth Lulua is a junior academic, just starting out in the health science profession's career. Taslim Ras and Bernard Gader are family physicians. Bernard Gader particularly leads a homestay project where their students stay in rural areas with rural people, families who live in that area while they do a block in their medicine. And then Damaris Kivitz is really a community representative invited for that specific purpose to be part of the chapter. And so we've recrafted Ubuntu into Ubuntu so that the A is about paying attention to the asymmetries of power. We have to break boundaries in the hierarchies that exist. But essentially what we're arguing is this need to unleash the unique, make sure that we recognize each community as a unique entity by themselves. This paper is the second paper published from my PhD, and it speaks about envisioning a socially accountable doctor, a 3-axis curriculum emerging from final year conversation. Somebody said that they were coming who participated in the study, but I don't see him here. Anyway, the students of 2012 spoke about social accountability as being so poorly defined, about being about a web of interconnected relationships. But the really powerful statement was this final year student who stands up and says, in the middle of the pediatrics ward, he stands up and says, I'm losing my heart and I'm losing my compassion. And that's about the time it happened, in the middle of final year, where the system has beaten you into submission to such an extent that you have very little room for further ethical development. Most students, let me say, not everybody. But the other student argues for a more wide-angled view of things. A rural student that I remain proud of said in one of those interviews, if I don't go there, then who will go? And in fact, he spent his foundation years in a rural area and then went on to do a specialist stint in a smaller town. But the 3 axes they offer were reflection, understanding, complexity, and a focus on relationships. That paper I published in a journal which was in its second year of function, of running, a journal called the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in the South. It was a journal launched by Brenda Leibovitz and colleagues from Brazil and India, because they recognized that African scholarship was not getting into the mainstream scholarship journal. Partly, and I'll come back to that in a little while, we were not writing or thinking like they did. So I made the decision to publish this paper in that journal. The consequence, colleagues, is that it's a very poorly cited article because you can't find it on PubMed. This article doesn't come up even if you put a doctor into PubMed. And the education journal thought we were too lightweight, those of us who wrote in medical education. We were lightweights and they could never quote us for any reason, actually. They just thought we wrote ordinary stuff. But I want to show you this article, but this is Mantua. And so Tasha Wyatt writes about professionalism essentially from the underside in America. She writes about how African Americans are experiencing the difficulties of being called unprofessional because they've got dreadlocks, because they dress in a particular way. And so we wrote this piece just reflecting on our own feelings of alienation from the process. Mantua is far more vocal than I. She sent back an abstract where they said, we don't write like this. She wrote back to them, I don't care. This is how I'm going to write the abstract. That abstract went on to win the track in research that she was writing in. My view is a little bit softer. I keep wanting to know how we can learn the tricks. How do we mystify this elitist position so that we can make a difference? I just want to introduce Helen Perry and Jean Scrivanti, both nurses, both critical care nurses with whom I supervise a number of registrar MEDs, all of which were in this area of relationship, the relationship between surgeons and anesthetists. Surgeons wondering at what point do you teach anesthetists that they know everything? Because the way that anesthetists treat surgeons, you'd swear that they're speaking to idiots. And that was the surgeon's position in that context. The anesthetist said, why would a senior surgeon not come and start the case with me? They leave me with the junior registrar and I'm a senior consultant. I think these are important conversations. The experience of registrar mothers in an anesthesiology department, not women as registrars, mothers as registrars, and the things they have to navigate. And then a paper that we used soft systems analysis, we used rich pictures to understand why anesthetists were leaving the public sector. And so they drew pictures, one which they called Days of Our Lives, and after the chaos picture was a Peace in Our Time. This is a PhD from Sandra Spijkerman. My real achievement in this PhD is that we finally had a chance to apply the theory of cognitive load theory to the work of anesthesia in the work that in undergraduate anesthesia. And so the stories that the students tell is that all of the things they do that support their learning actually distract them completely. The registrars are not prepared for the role of teaching. They're waiting for things a lot of the time. All of these things add to the complexity of their learning and take away from what they might learn. It's been an absolute privilege to supervise Mantua, and we've done that with Tasha that I mentioned earlier, Eilert Cooper from Toronto University, and Anne George. Now, Anne George is an interesting story. Anne George, I know her from before because she lived next door to Barbara and his family. But I met her in the corridor in the same year that we got our PhDs in 2014. Her PhDs were how do teachers take up technology. And so I said to her, hey, don't you want to come and work at the faculty? And so we found an NGAP post. We got Anne appointed. And really, if you're in health professions education, you're probably aware of the contribution that Anne is making on a national scale. And so this has been a very privileged group to work with. But Mantua's study was really, if these students endured fees must fall, what happened to their professionalism? And so this study is really trying to configure what that professionalism looks like. They didn't think the doctors who were treating the patients badly were professional, because they were seeing that a lot of the time. But they reckon that in that engagement with people, with rights, they formed a particular kind of professional identity. And so the three of us have been emboldened to offer a comment in the critical conversations in higher education, where we've used vernacular words to describe professionalism, but recognizing that if we say professionalism is a social contract, what do we mean? Because our relationships with communities are so asymmetrical. Can you write a contract between two people who are not equal? I'm not sure. But if we're looking at communities, what do we decide is the identity of the community and what agency do we give? Because it's all of this idea of creating graduates. You know, in that rights event at Free State, when the one student urinated on the domestic worker, there was a lot of hullabaloo, and Eunice Ballum used to say, the reality is that degrees mean nothing because there's been no conversion in the way that transformative learning means later on. This is the thing I'm really proud of, and Vanessa's here in the audience, Vanessa Birch. This is what I've been doing for the last couple of months if I haven't been in the office. We've been running around the country trying to embed the WBA, the workplace-based assessment. This is a book that we launched at the SAHI conference, Trust and Entrustability in Medical Specialist Training in South Africa. This is the thing that Brandon was talking about, changing specialist education. And my real achievement in this group is that in this group of people, there is an author from every university that trains medical specialists. That is hardly ever achieved in the spaces that we work. And so the fact that we worked on this project for so long is a consolation because we've left nobody behind. I use this picture. I thought, Keith, that we had made this picture pretty. But this we haven't. So part of the pentagram, and I see Therese is smiling equally at the back there. Part of this pentagram is the idea that we have to engage the policymakers and the health administrators. One of the things that we've been doing in the Health Platforms Committee is recognizing that we have to increase collaboration at a shared governance level, a shared values level, and a joint planning and shared resources. So what these dots mean is that in joint planning, you can see how peripheral we are Nobody is close to the center of co-creation. This one is a little bit more scattered in the governance area because there's a very strong bilateral agreement in the province. Here in the values and culture, we say the same things about value. But every now and again, we get a fright by the province because they do something that's just completely outside of the frame. And so we have to say, hey, guys, can we talk about that again? But that's part of the reality, because I think what we're creating is a space where we can share the thinking. This was the first meeting of the student curriculum Makgatho, and I'm really proud of Sayur and Kwezi. They presented at the first MedEd conference in Kigali last year, and they did us really proud. Sayurin has taken this project, the curriculum Makgatho, onto an award at AMI. And so the real thing about this group is that I've encouraged them not to seek my permission or anybody's permission to think. And as a result, Sayurin is a significant thorn in my side because he asks questions that I don't always have answers to, certainly not ready. But really thanks to the students that have responded to that call. Because in many ways, what they're showing is this idea of competence. And Francois, Jackie, and I have been, what we've been doing with this paper for like 10 years now. But we haven't gotten it out. But it speaks about reframing competency-based assessment and engagement. This idea of knowing yourself, knowing others, but more importantly, being at peace with the system, which is not going to be perfect for a long time. How do we create graduates who know that that's the struggle that they will engage in? I want to honor my mother and father today because my father was a GP who went to a town in Vryheid with all of its quirks and issues and promised my mother that they would leave in 5 years' time so that he could go and specialize. Well, 30 years later, it's gone. And the reality of that is that my father became everything to that community. He really was my first expression of social accountability. He was a small town doctor running clinics from the boot of his car in places like Paladu, Ladreda, Peza. These are all small villages around the area. They were fluent in isiZulu. And yeah, I must say sorry for the little bit of isiZulu that I speak here every now and again. Interestingly, my dad was a GP, but the mayor who was mayor at the time while they were trying to create the colored township said to my father, Doc, jy moet oppas. As jy probeer om op twee stoele te sit, gaan jy val. And the notion was that if he wanted to advocate for the people of the community, as well as be talking to them as the rulers of the time, he was bound to get into trouble. And then my mother, Catherine Regina Green-Thompson, the first reflection of faith in action in my life. My mother didn't do any charity work for the life that was touching the change. And I could tell a story about Ashley, about cameras and such things, but I won't today. Let me just thank Barbara. It was the spring of 1987, and we bonded over the snotty nose of a little child in the pediatric ward. She was a student nurse at the time, and I was an overzealous medical student. It was in that time that I expressed to my friend that I really liked her, and I think I'd like to go out with her. And Roy then said to me, after being really irritated at the number of times I told the story, because guys, I really didn't know how to deal with women. I didn't do the courtship thing at all. But Roy said to me, if you don't ask her out, I'm going to ask her out. And I knew that I couldn't let that happen. And so I went to the house. And after a long courtship, we got married. And it's been a longer time together than I could ever have hoped for. So Barbara enkosi kakhulu. In those moments where my ambiguities have challenged me, you've provided a sense of direction. And in the times where I'm not quite sure what to say next, you're able to give me the strength to say what needs to be said. So thank you very much. And I'm recognizing your role even in the events leading up to tonight, both the video this morning and then the catering this evening. So thank you for always doing stuff that I don't want you to do, but then I really like afterwards. And then this is Andrea and Alexandria, who are twins, and who I was always very grateful didn't look alike, because I was sure I would have to kill one of them. But they're now a grown age, and you'll see again in that picture, the center is Cassius, my first grandchild, and Liam is at the back. He's Alex's husband. Yeah, growing up with Alex being a medical student in the medical school that I worked in is a story for a whole other day. This is my son, Nicholas. Nicholas is a good young man. He's 34 now, and that's his wife, Jade. And they continue to contribute to who we are as a family. And then I show this picture really because it's a bit chaotic, and I don't think you can quite work out who is where, but this is my 3 children and the increasingly center of our lives, Cassius. I've taught Cassius to call me Kulu, because I keep saying I want to value his speaking a vernacular language. But I was challenged by one of Alex's friends to say, you can't stop at Kulu, you've got to give some vocabulary. So that night, as I was putting him to bed, I rocked him a little bit, and then I thought I should better sing a Zulu lullaby. And I thought, and then I sang Senzeni now. And I thought, how do you indoctrinate a child so young? How can the only songs you know to sing be struggle songs? And so I come back to where I started at the very beginning. This slide is from a talk I gave at Walter Sisulu in honor of Kaya and Fenyana. You'll recall that letter I wrote on the first day in the faculty. We didn't know where we were going on that first day of COVID, of the isolation because of COVID. I wrote a letter in which I said to you, please bear with us. We will make decisions and remake them every day. And I wasn't exaggerating. Feels like I was a fortune teller at that moment. But the thing I wrote in that letter is that I would commit to listening with compassion, with walking with humility, and acting with justice. And you'll see in the subtext here that we're entering a period where I think those notions have to be deepened. Otherwise, they just look like a cream that you're rubbing on your neighbor. We really have to deepen the sense that compassion means we engage deeply with community needs. Humility means that we foster equal partnerships, whether they're in the university, with the province, with communities. How do we create equality? And this idea of implementing equitable solutions is the key part. But perhaps the next step for us is achieving the systemic change. Because when you listen to people like Paul Farmer and Guterres, we may be sterilizing the discussions of freedom because we have them in universities. The discussions of freedom and change have got to move out into the community. And for that, I'm very hopeful about the curricular transformation achieving that. And also the Healthy Future South Africa, that what Healthy Futures does is it's foregrounding the direct communication of community. Before I say thank you, let me just acknowledge that this professorship is awarded in the Department of Health Science Education. I'm really grateful that they're becoming my academic home for the next little while. I promise that I'll behave better as a member of the department in the next couple of years. Enkosi kakhulu.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Allow me to invite Dr. Keith Klute to offer his remarks. He's a man that I've come to know. His name is now synonymous with people-centered healthcare.
Thank you so much, Lionel, for that really inspiring talk. But also thank you for affording me the honor to share a vote of thanks on behalf of Lionel. So Lionel, I really love and drawing from your lecture, the age of transformation, the stories of care, how you've taken social accountability and you've created as a heuristic to talk about Ubuntu. I'm reminded about relationships that we're trying to foster across institutional silos and the grounding values of inclusivity, honesty, and fairness. So those dots that you saw there comes from that grounding values. But I love the way that you finished off to say, listen with compassion, walk with humility, act for justice or with justice, and achieve systemic change. So it gives me the honor to have 5 sets of thanks that I will share with all of you. The first one is to Prof. Mosabala, Prof. Collieri, Prof. Ramagondo. Thank you so much for honoring Lionel in this manner and sharing this platform with me. Thank you. The second set is for all the deputy deans, the director, the managers, the academic administrative team, the colleagues in human resources, finance, communication, marketing, all in the deanery. And a sincere thanks to all the heads of departments from the different clinical departments that are represented here. And thank you for creating the ecosystem around Lionel that allows social accountability to flourish. Thank you to all of you. And you could see Lionel light up when he spoke of passion for the third group of people. And it's really acknowledging with deep gratitude from Lionel, all the family members, the friends, the loved ones, whose presence reminds us that academic journeys are never traveled alone. But a special thanks to Barbara, and you can hear from what he was saying, whose steadfast support has undoubtedly been a source of strength and inspiration throughout his entire journey. But you can also hear his recognition of Andrea, Alexandra, and Nicholas, and you can see the light that Cassius has brought to their lives. Thank you to all of you. And then to all the students, lovely to hear all of you. Titi, Suert, Saurin, Sabello, Luto, and then Chris that will follow me. Thank you so much for being here and making this event and the talk that Lionel talks about social accountability in education and speaking so eloquently about what Lionel means to all of you. I guess, like Brandon, whether we all call him LGT from here, we'll have to see. So thank you for doing that. Then finally, Kelly, Paul, Marlon, Jessica, Lynn, Ashley, Adila, and the Janikers. All the people that have taken the time and the care to bridge all the things that needed to be done behind the scenes to make this event possible tonight. On behalf of Lionel, thank you for your dedication, your generosity of spirit, and your commitment to excellence to have such a wonderful event. Then for all of you for being here, thank you for joining us.
Sawubona. Perhaps our distinguished speaker's most favorite word. It's not student representation, like Titi said. I'm surprised he didn't include it in his lecture, but considering its meaning to him, I can understand why it's his favorite. Sawubona, an ancient isiZulu greeting, meaning I see you. But in the way Prof interprets and utilizes it, it extends beyond simply meaning seeing the person standing in front of him as he greets them, but acknowledging their whole personhood, recognizing their diversity, struggles, and achievements. What a privilege then to acknowledge Prof tonight, sorry, LGT tonight, and be able to return the greeting unto him. It is evident from his story that he has spent much of his career seeing others, his students, colleagues, fellow researchers, patients, community members, and family. I've personally experienced this through my work at Shoko when Prof has attended our annual Family Day clinics. For anyone who knows him, he doesn't like coming into these spaces as a distant guest of honor, only there for the photo opportunities in his finest Madiba shirt, as good as he looks in the photo opportunities. No, he rolls up his sleeves and he gets to work. He starts seeing patients with students, he shakes the hands of community leaders, and he helps the gogo standing in the sun find a seat in the shade. In this way, people feel seen by him. Further reflecting a spirit of social accountability, at Prof's request, I've displayed this QR code through which guests can support Shoko's further work. It is clear then from these examples that Prof does not only believe that socially accountable education is the central purpose of training health professionals, he leads by example. So Prof, thank you for seeing all of us students. Thank you for seeing the fantastic professionals you have supervised and mentored over the years. Thank you for seeing the community so fully and for modeling for the rest of us what it means to be a socially accountable educator and health professional. And so I think it is now appropriate and perhaps long overdue that we can all look Prof in the eyes tonight and say, Sawubona, Professor Lionel Green-Thompson, we see you. Thank you all for being here this evening, and I'll invite you to exit the venue and enjoy the catering outside Uhamba Kahle.
There is still so much for you and me to do. And I am going to sit right here.